welcome everyone. Thank you for your time. Welcome to our Visionary Unicorn Builders in Southeast Asia. This event is organized by Mount TJ West in Silicon Valley and Singapore Global Network. So my name is Steve. I'm your host and moderator today. Today, our webinar's goals are to help our audience to understand the technology and innovation landscape currently in Southeast Asia. That's our goal number one. And number two is really hear the entrepreneurial stories of our proven serial entrepreneur panelists and learn from their journeys on their successes and also their mistakes. So let's start. I'd like to introduce my organization, Mount TJ West. So Mount TJ is a nonprofit science and technology professional association founded in Silicon Valley 34 years ago, from technology leaders from Taiwan as well as Silicon Valley. Our founders include Terry Guo of Foxconn, Stan Shi of Acer, and Li Pu Tan of Walden International, and few others. Mount TJ's mission is to enable technology professionals and corporations on both sides of the Pacific Ocean to network and to share valuable experiences in investment, in management, cross-border business expansion, cutting-edge technology, and business information exchange. Through our very active networking platform, the Asian American technology professionals in Silicon Valley went from being under-networked and under-resourced to establishing hundreds of businesses and building billions of dollars of enterprise value. So as your moderator today, my name is Steve Shah. I'm a serial entrepreneur, board member, and angel investor based in Silicon Valley. Currently, I serve on the board of Mount TJ. I've lived and also worked in Greater China and Southeast Asia for 20 years and exited 3 startups I founded in enterprise software and digital marketing. I'm currently building an online education startup in Silicon Valley and China. So thank you. I also want to introduce Singapore Global Network. Let me see if Shen Hong's online right now. So he's not. He'll join us pretty soon. He's just wrapping up his current meeting. So let me introduce our panelists today. So we have 3 very reputable and distinguished guests. First one, I'd like to welcome Joel Neal, a good friend of mine. Rockstar, 15 years of serial entrepreneur experience in Asia. Joel founded multiple leading edge companies in Southeast Asia. He has pioneered disruptive game-changing technology companies in Southeast Asia, from e-commerce, social and local commerce, group buy, social news, social advertising, to O2O digital payment. A young CEO, entrepreneur, investor, and board member. A recipient of Ernst & Young Emerging Entrepreneur of the Year, and also named Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. So the list goes on. Joel, floor is yours. Please give us a self-introduction. Thank you.
Hey guys, good morning or good evening, where you guys are at. So I've known Steve for more than 15 years. So Steve was actually one of my first angel investors in my first company. Took a bet on us when, me and my co-founder, Kylie Ng, if any of you guys have met him, who currently runs the 500 Global Fund. So thanks so much. Happy to be connecting with you guys this morning. So for the past 15 years, I've been focused mostly on building consumer tech companies in Southeast Asia and the broader Asia. Started off with media and then eventually evolving into e-commerce, and fintech. So currently unemployed, because I exited my last company 3 months ago. So just happy to be here. Thanks.
Oh, you're very modest. Thank you. I'd like to introduce you to my next guest, Ben Vu. Born and raised in Vietnam, worked super hard to come to Silicon Valley, study and receive her master's degree in education and MBA at Stanford University. Work at a global strategy consulting firm, Booz and Company. She's the founder, CEO of ELSA, the world's best and smartest English pronunciation application with more than 40 million users. a recipient of dozens of global reputable awards, including the winner of the South by Southwest, the Gold winner of Asia Pacific Stevie's Awards, National Honoree of Talent from the Vietnamese government, to Vietnam's top AI expert, a popular speaker at many distinguished events ranging from South by Southwest, ASU plus GSB, EdTech Asia, GSB, Google, GTEx Dubai, and many more. It's our honor to have you, Ben. So please take it away and do a self-intro of yourself.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's such a great honor to be connected to the group today, and very excited to hear from other super well-respected panelists and a lot to learn from, as well as share a little bit of what I have learned and the mistakes and all of the things that I have made in the last many years as I started the company. I started my company about 7+ years ago, Elsa, and currently reside in the Bay Area. But I do travel quite frequently back to Southeast Asia. Joe, actually 500 Startup Vietnam was one of my very first angel. So I'm very familiar with the 500 family here. But it's an honor, and I look forward to the panel.
Oh, excellent. I didn't know that. So you must know Kylie quite well. Thank you. My last one is JX Lai. JX is a fintech entrepreneur based in Singapore. He was the former COO and CPO, that's product, of Endow Us Singapore, Asia's leading digital wealth management platform. Before Endow Us, JX actually worked in Silicon Valley for many years for Dropbox and Lyft as a product manager. And then he went to Shanghai, China to work for ByteDance, TikTok's parent company, as a product manager. So JX has rich experience working in Southeast Asia, China, and Silicon Valley. JX received double engineering and economic degree from the University of Wharton, University of Pennsylvania, also a master's degree holder at the Stanford University as well. So he just launched his brand new startup. So JX, to you, talk us, please introduce yourself a bit more.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, guys, for having me. I'm JX, born and raised in Singapore. Been here through most of my life, through high school and then through military. Went in college for US. Started my career in the Singapore government with the Singapore EDB, which is the parent organization of the Singapore Global Network, which is a sponsor of this event. So it's great to be a big part of that. And then later on, moved back to the Bay Area to work at a couple of tech companies like Dropbox and Lyft, and really experienced the boom of Silicon Valley in the early 2010s, which is kind of like the second or third wave. And then after that, was very fortunate to have the opportunity to move to China in mid to late 2010s and experience the boom and the bloom in Chinese technology companies, which is namely the second wave after the first wave of BAT of Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent. Where you see in the second wave, you have the more innovative companies like Didi, like Meituan, Dianping, like Pinduoduo, and of course with ByteDance, and just seeing the rise and the growth of these companies. Decide to move back to Singapore in 2019, and that's when we started Endow Us, which through COVID became one of the largest and fastest growing robo wealth advisors in the world. We did it for the past 3-4 years, and then decided, to sort of start my next company, which is around banking integrations, and that's what we're doing now. We just started at the start of this year, and so it's great to be back, building from zero again, and also to be in the company of like-minded entrepreneurs and this community. So thanks, Steve.
Oh, thank you. All right, excellent. Oh, you certainly have a lot of experience with a lot of famous companies. So we're going to jump right into our panel. So the first question I'd like to ask all three of you is regarding the whole thing about artificial intelligence. So AI is perceived as fundamental as the creation of a microprocessor, the personal computer, the graphic user interface, the internet, the mobile. So it's a big game changer. It will change the way people work, learn, communicate, and it will change all the industries. So all the industry will need to reorient themselves around this new technology. So I'm just very curious about how is that being adopted in Southeast Asia? Is your company using AI today? Are you using it internally or externally? I'm going to ask all three of you. So let's go with Boo first, because I believe you're actually adopting AI quite heavily for your English pronunciation app.
Yes, thank you. It's a great question. And just for the audience, for those who might not be familiar with the company, what we do, we started the company in 2016, is to build an AI English speaking tutor using voice recognition technology to help listen to people as they speak English and giving them feedback on multiple dimensions so that they can improve their speaking skill and be more efficient and fluent in their communication in English. And so with that premise, we actually started the company way before AI and generative AI now that everybody thought became a hype, right? Like, and our company is AI first because the reason why I started the company was learning to speak English has always been a challenge for me personally growing up in Vietnam, because even though we would be really good at reading and writing and taking tests and grammar, like my husband is an American, and I usually joke to him that I probably know way more English grammar than he could ever explain to me, because I spent 20 plus years learning every single grammar textbook. But speaking English is a very different journey, and it requires a one-on-one attention with a native teachers, which becomes very expensive. It becomes not accessible, right? And so when I started the company, I really want to democratize that access to learning to speak better English, but relying on human would be a hinder for massive reach to a lot of people around the world, especially in the lower income region. And so we started the company AI first, right? Like we built this voice recognition technology. And to Steve's question, we actually built everything in-house. We don't use a third-party technology because all of the big giant voice recognition technology built by Silicon Valley or US-based companies are primarily trained to understand you when you speak really good English, but they are not trained to understand you when you speak English with an accent. And so since the very first day, we built all of the AI technology in-house. We own it. It's proprietary to us, but it's also became a huge differentiator for us in the market to become one of the leading apps leveraging AI to help people speak better English. And now AI became a hype, right? And so everybody's talk about AI being able to teach you English, but we actually started out on that journey way before it became a trend. And so we live and breathe AI basically every day now since the first day of the company.
Got it. I'm going to come back to you on that because I'm very interested to understand the AI development or sophistication in Vietnam. I would imagine you have a development center in Vietnam. So I'll come back to you on that. But let's move on to Joel. I know you exited your business, but prior to that, how are you using or did you use AI in any way?
Not really, right? So I think if I take a step back in Southeast Asia, it's very common to throw people to problems, and when you start scaling, yeah. So therefore, you see, thousands of people in operations as the company scales, as platforms, get more requests, so on and so forth. But I think, of course, in the current financial, climate, a lot of Southeast Asian companies are now needing to also sort of manage their costs. And therefore, like automation and AI is something they've started to look at. So I'd say in the region is probably at its infancy, especially in markets, developing markets, right, where cost of talent is actually much lower. I'll specifically talk about the consumer segment in which I'm a bit more familiar with. So if I look at using AI in terms of the consumer tech companies, I think there'll be like three areas. The first one is, of course, customer service. Yeah. So I think what's starting to transform, we're starting to see consumer companies, apply better predictive AI into like chatbots. So think about chatbots like 3 to 5 years ago. It's actually very difficult. In fact, the experience is unpleasant. Yeah. So when you engage with a customer service chatbot, usually the customer satisfaction score drops significantly, right? Because you feel like the company actually doesn't care, right, about what problem you're facing, and you get pushed, right, into different FAQs, so on and so forth. So I think that's one area that's going to be transformed. The second area is product personalization. So this is a topic that's been going on for like 5-10 years in the consumer tech space. And a lot of companies have not got this right. Including the companies that built back then, whether it's a Groupon in Asia or even like Fave, every other week or every other month, we're talking about how do we personalize the app better, right, for consumers. So I think that piece is going to be transformed, right, significantly with, better AI technology. Last but not least is marketing. So a big part of consumer companies would be the marketing piece, especially in terms of content creation. So we're starting to see, in the companies that I invest in, they're starting to see very, very lean marketing teams that's using a lot of AI to generate content, to also like create a loop that the content's iterative and continues to perform better and better over time. So I think Southeast Asia is probably at the early stage, of this. By the same time, opportunities would be in these three areas, right? Of, customer service, product, and marketing.
Is this something that you feel, because you just stepped down as a CEO of a very large company, is this something that's all of a sudden picked up drastically and everybody's talking about it? The VCs are looking at AI companies, start up to invest. Do you feel they're just sudden change of conversation?
Yeah, so the company that I was building is about 8 years old. So I think at that stage, sort of the transformation would literally be a bit slower, right, as compared to a company who's just starting off the ground. So I've seen this from two lenses. So one, I've been investing in consumer tech companies. I've done 7 investments in the past 2 months. Like a lot of them are starting with thinking about efficiency from day one, right? As compared to when we were first starting, it was the money was actually, or they consider money is cheap, right, or easy to access. So we were just chasing growth, right, and scaling up and just throwing people into problems. So now, as the financing handbrake has been pulled, so a lot of companies are now, right, kind of revisiting that piece. So that's why you see in the past 2 years, the larger platforms have been focusing a lot on layoffs, right? So if you talk to CEOs in this part of the world, what's the top of mind is reducing costs. How do they actually lean up the organization? So good topics for AI, right, as a solution in some of the areas that they're working on.
Got it. Thank you. So let me go to JX on the same question. You're running you stepped down from another company. You just started a new one. So you're an engineer, product person. What about AI? What's your thoughts on that? And based on financial services as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because, Acme, which is the company that I started to help with banking integrations, we started at the start of the year in January. And, that coincided very quickly with the whole AI boom that we've been seeing over the past 2 months. And so suddenly all of the conversations went from, hey, JX, what you're doing is great. You have a lot of institutional knowledge, you know how to integrate with the banks too. Hey, will generative AI be able to take over all of this work? Can you just upload the bank's API documents and then magically, you can just figure out a way to how to connect with that. So the conversation has all been suddenly centered around that. And it really did make me think as a founder, because what is the value and the skill set that we bring when there is something else that might be able to do it better? And I think that my conclusion is that AI is very hype driven, as with most things, and we know that right now it's in a hype. And so the problem with that is that everyone is sort of trying to explore that for the sake of doing it. So it's kind of like a hammer looking for a nail, and it's not always a bad thing because that sort of forces innovation. But I think then when that is taken to an artificial degree, then that kind of becomes very disruptive to your own company's operations, because then your investors ask, your consumers ask. So for example, at Endowus, everyone's asking us, hey, how can you use AI to generate better portfolio returns? And that is actually a very bad question, because that then would imply that you want to sort of create maybe a hedge fund of sorts to try to, beat the market and have all of these secret algorithms. But our entire goal as a company is to say that we're here to give you beta returns, which is to say that we want to actually be, sort of riding sort of just the entire market returns instead of trying to bet for or against the market. Now, a better question would be, maybe generative AI in the Endowus context as a wealth advisor can be deployed to customer service, which is, to Joel's earlier point. And I think that that's a more reasonable sort of application, and we can think more about that. But I think that just comes to my point about, I think that in this sort of stage where we are in Southeast Asia, I think the really skilled founders and those that are not is the ones that are able to differentiate, hey, is this, sort of using AI as a hype or not, versus can I really use it And if it's not, there's no FOMO, right? Let's just see and let's keep a close tab. And so for us, coming back to my main point, which is, can generative AI just do all of these banking integrations? I think that it's possible one day, but right now, the banking integrations are so varied and it's so different. And a lot of this is hidden, right? It's not like publicly consumable, whereby there's still some value in having it knowledge. And then the question for us as a company is, how fast can we move along with that, to sort of capture those benefits?
Got it. All right, thank you. I want to come back to Vu. So you really use AI you used earlier for your product development standpoint. Do you do your product development here in Silicon Valley, or you're actually doing it in Vietnam? Because most of my very senior and very experienced Vietnamese engineers in Silicon Valley, they run big organizations. They all have a very large development center in Vietnam. It seems like there's just a lot of talents. There might be early stage talents rather than sophisticated AI talents, but do you have anything to share there in terms of engineering capability of AI? You're muted, so let's hear about that, Vietnam versus Silicon Valley.
Yeah, so we actually are in a little bit more interesting twist of that. So our company has been quite global from the start. So I'm based here in the Silicon Valley. We are Silicon Valley based company as headquarters, but we have a big operations and team in Vietnam. But we actually also have a team in Portugal where my CTO sits. And so he's the AI expert of the company. And he's my co-founder as well. And so we actually have our talent split across Europe, Silicon Valley, and Vietnam. And so the way how it works for us is that we really go after where the talents are. It doesn't really matter. So we had actually been globally distributed and remote before COVID happened in that sense. And fighting for AI talents, especially 6 years ago, especially in our space as voice recognition technology, was a huge battle because majority of them are at big companies like Alexa, Siri, Google, right? And it's very few companies out there that do voice recognition technology AI as a startup. And so that's the reason why instead of having everybody sitting in the same place, we started like opening up the talent pipelines in different parts of the world. Now, a lot of our AI team actually sit in Europe because that's where there's a lot more of them. It's a little less competitive. Full transparency, when I started the company, we actually want to place our AI team in Vietnam because that's where I'm coming from. But unfortunately, it wasn't enough of the AI talents in Vietnam that know the specialty in voice recognition technology. AI is a ginormous space, right? There's machine learning, there's image recognition. I think in Vietnam, I think the team or like the AI talents are a little bit stronger in machine learning as well as like image recognition, but less on the voice recognition. And we went a little bit too deep on that one side. And so we actually weren't able to find the right talents senior enough, right? We have a lot more junior, but it's not senior enough for us at the beginning. And that's why we sort of moved or have a lot more of our AI talent sitting in Europe and stay away from Silicon Valley just to avoid the competition in that way, because it was just hard for us to compete on talents.
Got it. So to wrap up the AI, I just want to share particularly with our US audience, in Asia, people's been talking about the market, I think across all the country, they've been talking about this whole digital transformation. I think they've been talking about this 20 years ago since the arrival of the internet. And large corporations, they're doing it. They do it, fairly actively. But, Asia is really primarily made up with small, medium enterprises. And I can tell you today, they're still trying to do it, all right? The very basic, even set up a very useful website can be a challenge, or a mobile app. So I think the whole thing about this whole AI transformation down to the corporation, it might repeat again, might take another 20 years for Asian companies to adopt. Okay, so I think right now people are just really caught up with this whole trend at this moment. Let's move along. Let's talk about Southeast Asia. So my next question to, I think right now I'll focus on Vu and Joel. Southeast Asia has many startups, thousands and thousands of startups over the last decade. A few proven, sizable, and regional successful technology companies like Grab, GoTo, Shopee, Lazada. Regional, large. Why is that? Is it so difficult to build a regional company? Let's go with Joel first. Well, you've done it. You've done it multiple times. Why is that? Why is it so just difficult to build regional-based companies?
Yeah, so I think I'll start off with like what are the ingredients to make a company scale up and be successful? It's intersection of three things. One would be funding, second would be the idea, and third would be the talent, right? So if you look at it, you just start with the macro, is that the funding climate in Southeast Asia started it's fairly infant, right? Or in a sense where it's probably about 12, 13 years old, where companies started to get more funding. So I think I read a report a couple of months back where, when I first started, Steve, when you were investing in Says.com, when we started, the funding per year for the Southeast Asia region was probably in a range of $200-300 million a year, right? You take $200-300 million, spread it across 10 countries, it's $20-30 million per country, right? If you think about in that scale, that is what a single company in Silicon Valley would get. Like the funding for one company or one Series A company is what a country would get in Southeast Asia per year. But then that has actually increased over the past 10-12 years. So in the past few years, it's reaching a range of about $7-8 billion, right? So so it's gone from $200-300 million to $7-8 billion. So in total, in the past 10 years, I think it's almost about $80 billion that have been invested in this region, right? So that being said, if you look at it, I think there's a handful of these companies that have actually succeeded, through this funding. A lot of them seem to be in the past 10 years building platform companies, right? So whether it's e-commerce, so with e-commerce, then comes the need for like on-demand companies and logistic companies, travel e-commerce companies. So I think that those type of companies have actually benefited in the past years, and that's some of those that you've named, right? So I think the next 10 years for Southeast Asia is going to be fairly different. Now today we have founders or entrepreneurs who have been there and done that. We are founding team members, right? So there's like tens of thousands of people who have been part of founding a startup. So that is probably common in in the US and the States, right? But this is for the first time, I think we've got decent talent. Even like someone like JX, right, on this panel, very distinguished, and is building a startup in Southeast Asia, and that's very rare. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have talents, right? Global talents like this, building talent companies in Southeast Asia. So I think the talent pool is growing significantly. And last but not least, I think the ideas are also starting to emerge, in Southeast Asia to solve local problems in this region, right? So with that sort of growing middle class, there's actually a lot of different opportunities, for companies to build, especially in the consumer space, whether it's to build new brands, build new platforms, for consumers to engage. So I think, we are probably at the early stage. This region is probably about 10-15 years old in terms of, like tech companies, and the next 10 years is going to be quite different.
So I take it next 5 years, we should see a lot more regional successful large tech companies. So that was just the first wave. Your Grab, your GoTo, your Lazada, that's just really first wave. The second wave coming in because of funding, because of talents, because of experience, products. So you're going to see a lot more mushrooming. You anticipate that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. In this region, when you talk to VCs, there's actually dry powder, that has been fundraised, right? There's actually $15 billion that is open to be deployed. We just can't find the right founders, and the right companies to deploy. So it's a bit of a different challenge than in markets like Europe or US, where I would think it's actually the opposite, right? A lot of great founders, a lot of great companies, but the funding has dried up because of interest rates, right? So so I think it's quite an interesting space.
So it sounds like Southeast Asia is reverse. Lots of money looking for great opportunities, mostly talents. So you got talents like JX, he can raise money quickly, right? Thanks. Vu, your perspective, your view, very few large regional Southeast Asian tech companies. Any thoughts on that?
I couldn't agree more on what Joel said, and I think the prediction, I'm actually very much aligned on that prediction as well. Again, I think if you look into the US and Silicon Valley in particular, right, I think the ecosystem is a lot older than the 10, 15 years of the Southeast Asia ecosystem. Yeah. So a lot of the companies, if you look back in Silicon Valley, when they started out, they also just solved for the local problem, and they barely even scale out of the Silicon Valley at the beginning, right? Just like you win Silicon Valley first before you even bother about everything else. And then, of course, with funding, resources, and more examples of company, how they got out of it and they became more global. And I think Southeast Asia will eventually get there, whether it's 5 years, 7 years, it's a little harder to know, but I think we would be able to get there. I think one thing that prevent us at the beginning to go there is, I think we look around, as we started a company, we look around and see what all of our fellow founders have done before, right? And I think the more examples that set the success that, oh, you can do it globally, then you do more of it. The less of that examples got set, the more people are scared about going out of their comfort zone. And I think it's also, in addition to three things that Joel said, it also came down to the vision and the ambition of the founders, but also influenced by the investors, right? Like, do they only care whether you only stay locally, or they actually are asking and pushing you, are you thinking about a global vision? And it started from there, because when you started from that, the company, it's a lot easier to say, hey, I want it to be a global company, and I pitch to investor that's a global company. I pitch from global investor because I want to bring in that diversity. And then I said, but I'm going to start in locally first, but then I'm going to scale it later. Versus when you started out, I think especially coming from Vietnam, and a country has also changed dramatically and grown dramatically in the startup ecosystem. A lot of the founders would just say, let me do Vietnam first and we'll figure out the expansion later. It might become a lot harder if you don't have that vision from the start, because once you build something so local, to grow outside of your country, you have to basically build it again. And it costs a lot of money. It costs a lot of time. It came down to like tech infrastructure, payment, all of that things, right? Versus if you say, hey, let's build everything with a global mindset, but then let's launch locally. And then once you scale, you just add more things, but you don't have to like rebuild everything. I think that made it a little less scary as well. So I think it's also come down to what the founders really want and what the investor really push for will then potentially push that global vision a little stronger versus where we are right now in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I personally, as an investor, I actually experienced that too. I think the mindset's all changing for all the entrepreneurs throughout the entire region. I don't think anybody's thinking about local home market anymore from day one. So there are always definitely 2 or 3 countries, if not the whole Southeast Asia. Sometimes they're trying to cross beyond that. But I do think it's quite difficult for them to come to the US or go to Europe or even China. So JX, you're doing your new things from day one. Do you have a global vision? Do you have a regional vision? And also in expanding beyond your home market, Joel might be in Malaysia, or you're in Singapore, Silicon Valley and Vietnam. So what significant challenges and opportunity did you experience building, as you move outside of your home market? JX, you're doing that right now.
Yeah, no, Steve, thanks. And I think this is really Steve's skill as a moderator, because I was just about to try to jump in, when Vu was talking about that. So thank you for, pointing it my way. But, when Vu mentioned that, having that global mindset, I totally agree. The biggest challenge is, how do you balance that with your ambition versus the practical reality? Because as we all know, in starting a company, especially at this current stage and climate, it's all about staying lean, all about focus, all about preservation and conservation. And man, I don't know if people realize this, but we are living in crazy times, not just because of the AI boom, but it's the first time where a lot of folks, I'm 36 this year, but plus minus 5 years, this entire generation has only grown up in the bull market. Right, when we all graduated in the late 2000s, it's only been up and up and up. And so in the last year alone, we don't even just have layoffs, we have multiple layoffs, right? Facebook has cut twice, it's going to cut another time in May. Google has cut once, it's going to have another cut. Lyft just cut twice. All of these companies are cutting and everyone's just like, man, what's going on? So in view of all of that, right, the idea of like, dude, I'm going to raise like, $5 million and I'm going to have a huge global ambition and blow the market apart and start expanding is no longer practical. At the same time though, if you just say that, hey, you know what, I just want to be very focused, work on one small thing, you might be setting yourself up for failure. So what does that mean for us and what we're building over here? I think that I would share sort of the unique take of applying that to fintech or financial services industry, because that's what I'm most familiar with. The biggest challenge with financial services that anyone will tell you is that the key thing that you have is not just about your product and service, but about the licenses you can get. So the biggest stumbling block to that is that you can have global in nature. For example, you say, I want to create, say, for example, a payments app across Southeast Asia. The problem though is that when I hear that, say, if I were to be an investor or if I were to be, sort of a board member, then I would be like, wait, are you serious? Because Southeast Asia has 8 to 10 countries, each of them a different jurisdiction. To get the licenses alone, you're pretty much dead. And so I think that it's really important to know that you don't want to overstretch yourself and think about too big because of certain constraints. So I think that the way I would tackle that is that what are all of the little things that we can do that will sort of make it extensible? So for example, what that applies specifically, and this is just good advice in general to everyone, is when you think about your bank account, right? In financial services, I need a bank because I need to receive monies, I need to pay out. Which banks can actually support me in the jurisdictions that I might want to go to in the future, so that I don't have to do all of the integrations over and over again. So specifically, for example, if I'm a Singapore-based company, working with DBS is great. But the moment I want to go to Malaysia, DBS is not there. And so then, so I feel that it's not just about like, oh, I have this ambition for all of that thing, but I think setting yourself up for success by taking these little steps and knowing what you might want to expand into, and so not cutting yourself short. So that said, I think that the true balance in going global and having that ambition and knowing to stay lean lies in sort of the practical decisions that you take as a founder in navigating that. And the answer is always, it's always the middle ground. It's neither one or the other. You need enough focus, but you can't have too much focus. At the same time, you need to have that vision, but you can't sort of sell yourself too much and believe too much in that, such that, you sacrifice sort of the early stages. And I think that the general rule of thumb is the earlier you are, the more focused you want to be. But what really helps is if you hang out with a community of founders that have done that before, that have that global exposure, and that can give you that reminder to always be thinking bigger.
Yeah, I do think, most of the ambitious entrepreneur today, they want to conquer the world. At least they want to go after the whole region. But isn't it kind of hard to develop your product from day one to be regionally suited? Because they're all so different. The consumers are different. The regulatory is very different. Joel, what is your experience there? You've done a mobile payment platform, mobile e-wallets. When you go out to different countries, that's very, very different. How do you, from day one when you develop product versus a reality when you roll that out? So what major challenges did you encounter rolling that out?
Yeah, so I'll say that, there are business models where it is naturally global by nature, and there are some that isn't, right? Or most that isn't. So that's where, like when Wu was talking about, thinking global, like when I look at Elsa, it's global by nature, right? English learning, or whether, I learned my Mandarin from like this platform Tutor ABC, it's global by nature, right? I'm sitting here in KL, I'm speaking to someone in Beijing who's teaching me Mandarin. And those are the beautiful business models, right? That investors would love to invest in. Then of course, if you talk about language learning specifically, then you'll fall under education. Is it regulated? Is it not regulated? And I would assume that it is not, right? In the, in majority of countries. Yeah. So I think that's a nice sweet spot. So if an investor was to look at a business, it's very attractive, right? Then kind of coming closer to what JX was sharing around fintech. So, I spent about 7 years building fintech in Southeast Asia. There's actually a few cycles, that we've gone through. So when I first started, Fave in 2017, the regulators were trying to understand what's going on, yeah, in this space. E-wallets was not even present. It was booming in China and India. So you start to see a lot of these regulators going to China, going to India, meeting the regulators there and trying to understand. So at that point of time, things were fairly loose. Yeah. So you could just, we call it the wild, wild east. Yeah. so you could just like launch fintech companies overnight. Yeah. And I'm sure you've also seen it in the crypto crazy, wild, wild east, right? But people just put money into, and deposit money into tokens, so on and so forth, right? But fortunately, unfortunately, the regulators have caught up, right, to this. And they've kind of over-indexed quite a bit. So today in like the fintech space, investors, the first thing when it comes to investing in fintech companies, the first thing that comes to mind is what's the regulatory within this space? Because it is going to be like, for instance, one of the insurtech companies in Malaysia, they've been applying for a license for 3 years and they haven't got it yet, right? So imagine, right, you've raised funding from seed investors and you have the product, but you can't go to market. You have 0 customers for 3 years. Yeah, so I think regulations play a huge role when it comes to to Southeast Asia. It's what JX mentioned. It's 10 countries. Yeah. So so I think that naturally global businesses definitely more investable, and those that are tackling especially regulatory type of industries, it's going to be a bit more challenging, right, in this current environment.
Got it. Thank you. Do you have anything to add there? Otherwise, go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
All right, no, I think George just noted, and I think he was exactly right? Like it really depends on your business model, and some is just a lot easier, and some require a lot more localization. And so again, for the founder, right, you just really have to think whether yours is the right model to go global or regional, or it might have a lot of hinders. And if so, I think what JX said, right, like you got to stay focused. You don't want to overbuild at the beginning, right, because you have so little resources and you can't think about conquering like 10 countries at once. You just have to really go one by one until you have the resources to expand it.
Yeah, I guess just do your homework from early days that, I guess map out your number 1 country, most likely your home country, number 2, number 3, and how do you actually design your architecture product from that perspective, and also understand something that's completely out of your control. It could be customer adoption, it could be regulatory issues, and I guess understand that, so work that into your product design. We're getting quite a few questions regarding talents in Southeast Asia, so I'm gonna sort of shuffle the question. And Vu, I know you might have to leave after 1 hour. So the next 2 questions you have to jump in regarding talent, okay? So based on observation, especially JX, you have worked in Silicon Valley for many years. How is building a tech startup in Southeast Asia different from Silicon Valley? Both Vu and yourself have done it. And how can US technology professionals, marketing professionals, entrepreneurs, investors participate in Southeast Asia, or in your journey or your friend's journey? This is really, really hot right now, Southeast Asia startup scene. So yeah, I'd love to hear that from you, JX.
Yeah, I can start, and just like 2 points here. The first point is that if you look at historically in the Southeast Asia scene, what was very different is that, in the US, it's mostly engineers, right? That, sort of came up with something and start something. I think in Southeast Asia, I think broad strokes generally, it's more you have a business-minded person, someone who worked in investment banking or in consulting, and then come on and then started something. And usually it's more of like a sort of a business go-to-market thing. And then technology is sort of like in second place. And that's why you can sort of you get lower costs. I mean, this is a very broad generalization, but that has kind of sort of characterized it in sort of like the last 10 or 20 years. And so what was interesting was that, for me, when I started my career, in the early 2010s, and I was figuring out what to build in Southeast Asia, it was actually tough for me, because I didn't have the networks, I didn't know anyone, and I could build anything, but it doesn't matter in a way. What's interesting now is that I think things have changed a little bit because we're starting to realize that, the sort of core engineering talent and the core appreciation of the technical skill set has really risen, especially in the last 3 to 4 years. And I think COVID has helped to accelerate that as well. So right now, the cool thing is that if you are a hardcore engineer with just some business sense, you can come on here and actually try to build a world-class company. For example, if you want to build a SaaS company in the fintech space like me, if you want to build, say, a security company, right now, Singapore, for example, is great because of its brand, as a trusted place, and then, SGN didn't pay me to say that, but, and then, you can sort of like, work, with a good group of people, because the beauty of a technology company is small but beautiful, right? You just need sort of like, a small group of very talented individuals, very experienced individuals, and people want to live here, people want to, be here. And so then you have an opportunity. So basically, my first point is that you see the wave of like, from sort of like very, very business oriented to then also having an opportunity if you're technically oriented to do something here. And then I think that should bode well, for folks in the US that are thinking about coming back. My second observation lies in the fact that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I mean, my second point lies in the fact that in a lot of ways, being in the US or in China, you still kind of see the next potential wave of what might be happening. And, what I'm trying to say is that a lot of people say that, oh, the whole copy from the US or copy from China is gone. So for example, Grab and, Gojek and all of these is like, okay, ride sharing was hot. Let's try to do it here. And then let's try to replicate here. I don't think that it's that straightforward anymore, but I think my point is that being in the US, naturally in the more technological advanced fields, for example, in fraud detection, in transactions monitoring, in identity, in KYC solutions, there is still an advantage, especially if you work for a big tech company. So many great companies came out because this guy worked on fraud detection at Square. And he's like, oh, wow, we're at the cutting edge because at Square, no one has solved and has experienced so much fraud. Why don't I come out and then build a company around that and apply that to the Southeast Asia context? That's perfect. Because that you have seen the future, you have experienced that skill, that is extremely valuable. And so I would say that, instead of like sort of copying big ideas like, oh, there's ride sharing, oh, there's group buying, whatever, I think that's all great. But I think that sort of the great companies have come and gone, and, Joel has already conquered that market. But I think that the more specific technical skill sets, if you work for a great tech company, always be thinking about what I'm working on is at the cutting edge. How can I take that out, create a business around that, and apply that to a market that's more nascent like Southeast Asia? I think that's perfect.
All right, that's a great insight, JX. Vu, you've been building this bridge. You're talking about Portugal, Vietnam, and Silicon Valley for a long time. So how can the US talents, because we have probably half of our audience is based in Silicon Valley as mostly engineers, if they want to participate this bull run in Southeast Asia for the next 5-10 years, how can they participate?
I think, I think what's very exciting is that there's a lot more tech-savvy startups coming out of Southeast Asia now, right? Because I think way more than it was even 5-6 years ago. I think the landscape has changed dramatically. Mm-hmm. And with that, I think the other thing is that Southeast Asia companies are also becoming more global in the sense that they're willing to recruit people outside of Southeast Asia because they want to bring in that best practices and the culture and the talents into that. So I think it's a perfect time for you with the Silicon Valley experience to come into Southeast Asia companies. And I think outside of engineering, I think the bigger one, and when I read about JX background, I'm like, wow, Southeast Asia really need that, is that product management. I think that's where we are not as expert yet in product management, because I think it was not born out of Southeast Asia in that job, right? I think engineers, I think we have done it a lot more. And so even for us at ELSA, right, we actually initially, we kept all product management in Silicon Valley because it was 6-7 years ago, it was really a struggle for us to find very experienced product managers that had a global product management mindset. And I think JX know exactly what I'm talking about, right? Like in that companies. But for us internally at ELSA, we then use all of the Silicon Valley product managers to then train and upgrade the product management experience within ELSA. And now I'm very proud to say that a lot of our product managers now sit in Vietnam. But even so, we have people coming from different parts, not just Vietnamese, right? But we actually are confident enough to house our product management team in Southeast Asia. Right. And now actually our head of product designer right now sit in Singapore, right? So it's started housing in Southeast Asia. So I think it's a perfect opportunity, because I think Southeast Asian startups need these Silicon Valley talents. You have a lot to add in terms of value. So I think your experience go a long way there. And you have a big impact because you actually built up that pipeline of the talents and the best practices in the region that years later is going to rip up the effect. So I think just go out there, right? It's beautiful countries. We actually have quite a few, even within our company, because we have a big office in Southeast Asia, especially COVID came. We actually opened the office first, because Silicon Valley, even up to today, people don't open the office, right? So it's like pretty much remote. We actually have people from Silicon Valley and Europe actually say, hey, can I move to Vietnam office, because it's much more fun there. And so we actually migrate people out there to Southeast Asia and have a more global presence there. So I think if anybody in Silicon Valley thinking about joining a startup in Southeast Asia, I think it's a perfect time, because your talent is so valued, right? I think it goes a lot longer way than where you are in Silicon Valley, right? And it has a bigger impact as well.
Joel, I'm gonna come back to you on this one too, because you hire a lot of international talents, okay? But let me do a quick plug. Singapore Global Network, it's my co-host. Xuan Hong, he's a regional director. He's on this panelist, he's on this webinar, but he cannot talk because he logged in as a guest. So I'm gonna, Xuan Hong, I know you can hear me. Can you just please give a description in the chat, let people know how to reach you? So if you're in Silicon Valley or in the US or anywhere in the world listening right now, if you're interested in Southeast Asia, go there as an entrepreneur or just as a professional, you should talk to Xuan Hong from SGN, or I can actually raise my hand. You can also talk to me. I'll be able to help you, because I'm Taiwanese American. I went to UC Berkeley, computer science. I worked in Silicon Valley as a software engineer for 5 years in a company that sent me out there to Singapore to set up a regional headquarters. And I was supposed to go there for 1 year and come back to Silicon Valley, but I ended up to become an entrepreneur for 20 years. And I did 3 startups and also did a lot of investment. So I know the region quite well. You know, if you're young, you've got nothing to lose. You should consider. It's a great place to, I think you want to be a big fish in a smaller pond rather than a tiny fish in Silicon Valley. So both SGN's Xuan Hong Steve will be able to talk to you, help you there, okay? Boom, don't go, I know you have to go. Real quick, I wanna ask you about the biggest challenge in Silicon Valley everywhere for technology companies, the talent shortage, and also rapidly rising salary. So how do you deal with that? I know you have to go, so you answered that, but Joe, I'm gonna come back to you on that. You know, you hire a lot of international stars to work for you, so talk about that too. Go ahead.
How do we handle the rise, the
rising salary and shortage of staff? How do you deal with that? That's a big challenge for every tech company in Southeast Asia. There are only so many talents.
It's so ironic, right? Like with recession and every single company's laying off, then it's so much easier to hire. But then majority companies have hiring freeze, which can make it hard, right? But I still remember, like even just right before all of the recession happened, every single offer that we send out to engineers or product managers, it's like, it's harder than getting a term sheet from an investor to a certain extent, because it's so nervous that you don't even know why they rejected you. All right, because really, we're just like, you begging them, it's like, please, we do everything we take and join, and yet you can't. And salary went up like crazy. 20, 30, 40% higher month over month. You wouldn't even joke on that one, right? And so it was a nightmare to compete on that talent. And it's not just for us, it's every single stage. Like if you're later stage, you have more money. There's other later stage company that compete with you. If you're early stage, there have more early stage companies. So I think it was hard. But that's why for us, we don't want to get trapped in that, right? So the moment we saw it hard, we said, is there anywhere else in the world that can get the right talents that we want? Because, you know, once you already global, it doesn't really matter whether you add another person randomly somewhere else anymore, right? You already have a global company that run in that global mindset, just to stay away from that competition, and make it hard for us to compete. But I would say when the economy was good, it was quite a nightmare. And the nightmare came down to like even recruiter, like recruiter won't even work with us. And it's like you gotta get in line with like 3 months waiting for the recruiter to say, oh, you want to hire that position? 3 months before we start your search, right? Like that was how bad it is. It's like trickling down. And of course now it's the opposite, right? I got recruiter call every day. It's like, do you want anybody else, right? Like and so the market got a lot easier to breathe now. But you don't want to be in either situation, right? Because right now there's so many talents and you don't hire crazily. And then back then you hire crazily and nobody even take the offer to that extent. It was not easy.
Okay, Joel, let me come back to you. I want you to answer two things. First, the last questions. Vu, if you have to go, just go ahead. I know you have another meeting to run to. So thanks so much. Okay, we'll catch up again. So Joel, the last questions regarding U.S. How can U.S. technology professional, entrepreneur, investor participate in Southeast Asia? And you hire a lot of international talents because you run an entire group on Asia Pacific, from Japan all the way down to Indonesia. So that's thousands of people that you work with, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is, how do you deal with this global tech talent shortage and also rapidly rising salary? So answer both.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll just do a brief one. So I think times have actually changed, right? As what Vu was sharing. So maybe 2-3 years ago, it's sort of better to be an employee, right? Because, if you are an engineer, you'll be super sought after, get paid a lot of salary. And now actually the jobs are drying up, right? Because the big tech companies are now forced to, be profitable or reduce their burn. So there's actually a lot of talent in the market today. So I remember when I put up a product manager hiring 6 months ago before I left, we had like 50 applicants, right? And before that, we could even barely get 10. So it's now a employer market, right? So if you have an idea, if you want to build something in this region, it's a good time to be an entrepreneur. Yeah. So maybe 3 years ago is a great time to be an employee. Yeah. So I think it's maybe that's one takeaway. Second is that, if you want to do something in Southeast Asia, you kind of like, you have to be here at least to experience it yourself. Because if not, you'll be looking at Southeast Asia from a map, right? And it's not, it's difficult to understand it because every country is so different. So while there's 600 million population in these 10 countries, every country is it's a unique country by its own. So I think it's a good time now, right? It's summer all year round in Southeast Asia. So at least, the worst case is that you go back to the US with a good trip, right? And a good tan. There's a lot of nice beaches here. So in fact, a lot of entrepreneurs, from US that I know, in the past 10 years, actually first came to Southeast Asia for a holiday, right? And then they loved it so much, because that's actually more appealing, right? Than thinking about coming to Southeast Asia for like a conference. Yeah. I mean, that's quite serious. Yeah? That's almost like you have to be quite determined to want to do something here to do that. But, there's no harm, just coming here for a holiday and then mix it with a couple of meetings. I think there's an event link, right? That's happening on May 11th. So if you kind of put a few of these events to go to together with like a trip to some of the islands in Thailand and Bali, you may come together because eventually if you want to build something here, you got to live here, right? Or spend time here. And you want to, it's not just all work, right? You also have to enjoy your lifestyle here. That's why, Steve, you've managed to be here for 20 years, right? Because you enjoyed your lifestyle here. So, so I think it's a mix of both. No harm, right? If you got a month, so you should just pop by this region.
JX, you want anything to add regarding how do you deal, because you're a startup, you just raising your first round and you're hiring talent. Things changed, getting cheaper to hire people, a lot more resources now. What's up there?
I think so, absolutely. Like maybe I can speak more in a Singapore context. In the last 3 to 4 years, most big tech companies have expanded like crazy here, right? You have your Googles, your Facebooks, your Stripes, all of these companies have been hiring a huge ton of talent. And the great thing about that is that it does two things. it brings international talent. For example, you have transfers from Google and Mountain View or all over the world coming to Singapore, along with Facebook and all these. So people are now based in Singapore. And at the same time, it also offers opportunities for people from ASEAN in Singapore to get jobs at these great companies. Now, what's happening right now is that with all the layoffs, there are two groups of people. The group of people that got laid off definitely are looking for something. And it's actually sort of, a really critical time because of all of the visa situation. I mean, I think that being in Singapore is not as bad as in the US, but if you get laid off from a job, your employment past the clock starts ticking, you have to find something else, right? So there's a group of people naturally already looking for something. But at the same time, the group of people that did not get laid off, you kind of think about, man, what's next, right? Am I going to be next? Is this going to end? And so they'll always be thinking about, hey, is there something else that I want to do? Maybe I want to pursue this passion of mine now. It's a great time. Or maybe I want to find something. And so the sort of like contrarian or like the sort of perverse thing is then safety is actually almost like in a startup as opposed to being a big company. Because in a big company, you might get laid off because your entire team gets laid off. But in a startup, you're one of two or three or four or five. And because the startup in a seed round has raised like maybe $2 or $3 million, that's more than enough runway for another 2 to 3 or 4 years, which gives you more certainty than being in a big tech company. And so as a result, you then have access to all of these talent that you may not otherwise have before. And so it's a great time, to be out, getting across all variety of roles.
Yeah, that's exactly where you are. You got the runway. You're a startup. You won't lay off people. Okay, I want to be conscious of our time. We got 10 more minutes, and we have to get into QA. There are quite a few Q&A and good questions coming in. So let me jump into the next two questions. This is regarding innovation. Okay, Southeast Asia is not known as an innovation or innovator region. Unlike China, Web 1.0, 2.0, they copy and innovate from the West, surpass them. Now, they're copying them back. Overall, do you feel it's changing? Innovation in Southeast Asia, how is it changing? What is your view on this, Joel? Innovation in Southeast Asia.
So I wouldn't, so I'd say that right now, so I think Jake's covered, right? The point around taking a US model and replicating it in this region. So that was maybe about, the 10 years ago, that's what most entrepreneurs were doing. Now, as more companies have developed, like presence in Southeast Asia, we've started to realize that every market has like different needs. So our group, I would say like Southeast Asia, while there are 10 countries, there are markets that are, or countries that are more like developed countries, and there are countries that are developing, right? So maybe to kind of like split that into two. So for instance, like Singapore, it's like a developed market, right? And, while a lot of entrepreneurs are sort of starting or basing themselves in Singapore, if you want to tackle a Southeast Asia market, opportunity, you have to somehow, if you're tackling Southeast Asia consumers, right, or Southeast Asia clients, you would have to tackle the developing markets. And that's where developing market solutions comes in. So it may not be very obvious for someone who's, say, living in Europe or US to see that that's the problem, right, that the consumer market is facing, but you got to be like sort of on the ground to to see that opportunity and tackle that. So so I see a lot of startups today, they are tackling developing market challenges, right? And that's why you see more Indian-based investors or Chinese, I'd say actually more Indian-based investors picking up opportunities in Southeast Asia because they see the same challenges in markets like India, where it's also fast developing. So a lot of VCs in the region, has a lot of experience in India because they empathize with that. Whereas the lens of, say, a US-based VC may not empathize, right? Or may not fully understand and value add to that problem. So I'd say that the innovation, at least what I've seen, aside from, what Vu talked about, building global companies, is this area on developing markets in Southeast Asia.
Yep. So a lot of time, the big idea, it's copy from the West, but in order to adapt to the local region, especially there are many developing countries like Indonesia, Philippines, or Vietnam, but the solution in the US just not going to work. So that's where the innovation comes in, right? How do you actually develop your process, your features and functions, and and then work around that. That's what you see.
Yeah. I mean, an example is, maybe in the past 5 years, has become a bit more obvious, like QR code payments. Yeah.
Yeah.
So when I go to the US, like none of my friends understand what this is about. So what problem is this solving? Why do you need QRs pasted everywhere? And then they felt that maybe, is it gimmicky? Is it just a marketing thing? But actually it's because there's a large cash economy here, right? In Southeast Asia. And digital payments is actually, not accessible because the banks are mostly focused on, people with, they call it the bank segment, which is, people with a higher income. So you have a huge group of people who actually don't have banking services. And then therefore QR payments, digital banks, and all this becomes the opportunity for that segment. Yeah.
Got it. Thanks. JX, your view on innovation in Southeast Asia versus the innovation that you built in Silicon Valley.
I think that the innovation sort of is applied in a different way. The way I think about innovation in Southeast Asia is more similar to innovation in China. And what I mean by innovation that in China is that in China, the innovation is in the application of a technology in a certain way. So for example, when you open, the very famous example is you open an e-commerce app in the US and it's Amazon, and then you open an e-commerce app in China. And the key difference is that, in Amazon, everything is very clean. You have as little items on the screen as possible. It's very sleek. Whereas in China, every single pixel is sort of optimized, right? It's sort of jammed with a lot of different buttons, different cards and everything. And at first glance, a designer who's trained in the US might call that out and say that, what, that's so ugly, that's so messy. How do people even find stuff? But in China, people love that because to them, time is of essence. It's about efficiency, right? I want to be able to consume more things and I want everything there so that I can click on it. And then that, in itself is already an application. It's already an innovation. And it's not necessarily a deep technical innovation, but it's an innovation in responding to a user behavior. But that's not where it ends. After that, the realization is that when people come on an e-commerce app, it's not just to shop, it's not just to look for stuff. They want to interact with that. And so you had, apps like Pinduoduo that says that, hey, why don't you play this game of just planting a seed every day? And if you do it consistently for 30 days, we'll send you a box of fruit. That then is the next level of the innovation application. And I think that is a type of innovation and applications that we're seeing in Southeast Asia, especially for consumer-facing apps in countries like Indonesia and the Philippines. I think that's happening very organically and rampantly, and that's on the consumer-facing space. On the B2B space, I think to Joel's point, I think it's really about what consumer behavior dictates. For example, businesses want to accept QR codes, and businesses want to accept bank transfers over real-time payment networks. This is getting sort of a bit deep, but the thing to understand is just that in the US, real-time payment networks doesn't exist. It's only ACH. Whereas in Southeast Asia, almost everyone is not just on real-time payment networks, but the governments are linking it together. From India, Singapore, UPI, and FAST, Singapore to Thailand, PROM, you can essentially do a cross-border transfer without touching the international SWIFT TT framework through local payment methods. And that would then just explode in terms of what you could potentially do that you would never be able to do, anywhere else in the West.
Okay, got it. Thanks for answering the innovation part. My last question, we got 4 minutes before we move into Q&A. My colleague, Wilson, why don't you come on board? You're gonna be running the Q&A session, but let me finish my last question. I do think this is important. With the technology sector crackdowns by the Chinese government in China, entering Southeast Asia market is becoming a critical success factor for most of the Chinese technology companies. Based on your observation in Southeast Asia, has the Chinese done well? What have they done right from your perspective, and also what mistakes have you seen? Joel, you see a lot. India and China, they're all coming to Southeast Asia.
So I think that the two big markets that have a lot of entrepreneurs or VCs have started to come or have come in the past 5-10 years is from China and India. Yep. I would say like the Indians have kind of got it better, right? Or at least so it started off with the VCs coming in. So a lot of the entrepreneurs were focused on the Indian market in the past 5 years. And maybe in the past 2 years, they've started to come out. So for example, the company I started, Fave, we got acquired 2 years ago by an Indian fintech company. And since then, there's been another 4 to 5 acquisitions of Indian companies in Southeast Asia. So they've come with the approach of VC first, and then they start some of the entrepreneurs start to come to Southeast Asia to build companies and then acquisitions. The Chinese investors, on the other hand, they came in trying to build the companies themselves first, right? So a couple of them, went to Indonesia, set up base, and they didn't get too much success, in doing so. And then they've sort of like changed their approach. So in the past 5 years, Chinese investors have become more of LPs in the fund itself rather than GPs, so that they can participate in the region and they can learn from the local GPs first. So that's one. And secondly is that they focused a lot on the e-commerce and logistics sector, which they have a very good understanding about, right? In China. So if you look at our two largest e-commerce platforms in Southeast Asia, both Shopee and Lazada, it's actually backed by Chinese investors in some form or another, right? So whether Tencent with Shopee and Alibaba with Lazada. And they also invest in a lot of logistics companies, which they have good understanding from. So I think just different approach, right? I think Chinese investors came in probably slightly earlier, but then they didn't do too well. Then they've sort of pivoted their approach to areas that they have better strengths at.
Right. So they're adjusting as well. JX, anything to add before we end there? You want to just throw in a couple lines?
Yeah, I think that what's interesting is that maybe the only point I'll add is that what we do see a lot and difference between the Chinese and Indian companies is that at least in Singapore, a lot of the Chinese companies have actually set up a pretty substantial presence here. So ByteDance and TikTok, for example, have hired in the thousands, right? In a couple of thousands in Singapore in the past 2 to 3 years. And you also have sort of like the regional headquarters of a few other, tech giants. All of the tech giants basically have a presence here. Whereas for Indian companies, I think that they might be located as a headquartered here, but in terms of the number of headcount and the presence, I think very much less so. So I think that the jury is still out. I think, what people have to realize is that it's a long game, right? Entrepreneurship is like a 5 to 10 year journey. We're only at the first phase of, sort of like the big, Chinese, Indian companies and entrepreneurs coming here. And so I think it's still a very early, I think they do bring with them certain advantages, but I think what makes it a lot more exciting is that right now, Southeast Asia has become more like a global platform. In the past, only Chinese and Indian, sort of interested, but now it's actually everyone, right? We have folks from Silicon Valley, we have folks from Europe, all coming here, and that makes the entire sort of battlefield a lot more interesting because you have that whole diverse mix of people trying to, build something interesting. And so I think there's no better time to explore that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we have come to the end of our panel questions. We have last 10 more minutes left. I want to be conscious of everyone's time. It's dinner time in Silicon Valley. So Wilson, I'm gonna pass it over to you. Do you have questions from the panel?
Yes, we do have a few quick questions. Given the time limit of 10 minutes,
yep.
So I selected 3 different questions for the panelists. So I'm gonna start the first one. So all of them actually highly related to human resources.
Oh.
So, but the first one I want to ask the panelists is that, could you guys give a brief introduction of the digital talent pool in major Southeast Asia countries? So who wants to start first?
Joe, why don't you go?
Jake should take this, huh? Digital talent pool. Yeah.
Yeah, happy to. So I think though, okay, so this is just, some of it is based on my own personal experience. Some of this is just based on more of like just understanding the context. But I'll break down, talent pool into sort of two main big categories, which is you have on the technical side, which is engineers and product managers, and then you have on the business side, right? And on the business side, generally we have folks like on operations, on marketing, etc. Like the general talent pool in Southeast Asia for technology or software specifically is as such. I think in Singapore, we have a lot of sort of investors and business people, right? Companies that start. In the last 3 to 4 years, we see a surge in sort of technical talent, of engineering talent. And so if you want really, really highly skilled talent, for example, you have like your AI engineers or your PhDs in something, I think Singapore is not a bad place to find them, but it's very expensive. Now, the interesting thing is, how do we think of Southeast Asia almost like an ecosystem, right? Where you sort of like have a headquarters here, regional offices where you can have the interplay. I think that in terms of engineers, you start to see that there are some, really good engineers in Vietnam and Indonesia. I mean, India, of course, has always had a good source, but in Indonesia and Vietnam in particular, you see the rise of that. I think that we all know already. I think maybe the only additional insight that I will add is that it depends on what sort of engineers we're looking for and sort of their verbal communication skill set. So for example, if the company is pretty Chinese and can speak in Mandarin, a very good alternative is also to look at Taiwan. People don't realize this, but in Taipei, it's actually filled with a lot of all of the biggest Southeast Asian companies. Like you have Paracel, you have Xfirst, you have Grab, previously you had Honestbee. All of these companies all have an engineering presence in Taipei. And so then you see how Taipei complements not just Vietnam and Indonesia in terms of that. In terms of operational marketing talent, I've seen Malaysia be a really bright spot, right? If you need to look for great customer service folks, if you need to look for great digital marketers, like I think that you have a great talent pool there where you can set up an office where they can handle all of that. So yeah, I think that's just sort of like a broad stroke of like, how I think about that digital talent pool in ASEAN and the broader ASEAN Greater China region.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that overall summary of talents. Wilson, you want to move next one, or Joel, you have anything to add? We move on. Okay, yeah. Sounds good. That's pretty good coverage.
Yep. And the following question, I try to just you already give a big picture of the talent pool. Right now, go down to the regional side. So the question for you guys is, when you go to the regional point of view, do you establish the offices in different countries, or you just set up one office and fly around? And the second question is, do you hire local talent for a local country head? That pretty much means you want to do the central office type of business or distributed offices regarding your talents, regarding your sales.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, Joel, you done every country in Asia.
Yeah, so I think it really depends on the business model, right? That you're building. So there's no real like one size fit all. So for Groupon, because it was a very local business back in 2010, when we were expanding across APAC, so we had like 2,500 people. Every country had about 100 up to 300 people, right? Because the main driver of the business was acquiring local merchants. Whether they were selling goods, they had a restaurant, or whether they were a travel agency, it's all local merchants. So the 100 to 300 people per country, I'd say like 60% of them were actually feet on street, right? Signing up merchants, because that was what drove the growth of the business. When I launched a fitness membership platform, which was called KFit, so we did it in 10 countries. So we only had 2-3 people per city. So that was it was more a city business because it's not a mass market product. It's actually more an affluent, right, or mass affluent product. And also in every city, there was only very limited number of gyms and fitness studios, within a range of 500 to 1,000. So we didn't look at it as a country business. We looked at it more like a city business. Then every city we had like 2 or 3 people. They all work from like co-working spaces. In fact, back then, again, this is Wild East style, right? We hired all of them on contract. So we didn't establish a company in most countries. And that was also how Uber launched, in Asia. So they hired most people from contract from the US. And then eventually, once you get to a certain scale, that's when you need to incorporate a company. And the reason why we do that is just much faster to market. So within a year, we were already in like 10 markets or 10 countries, right, to establish. But I think in today's day and age, you can't really do that. there's regulations and stuff have actually clamped down a lot more on that. But now today, what has happened is that there are actually HR type of companies that have established this regional presence where you can hire employees under those regional HR organizations. So in short is that, we're always finding the most efficient way to actually go to market, right? Whether is it you need to have a full team, you need to have 2-3 people on the ground, really depends on your business model. Then last but not least, of course, maybe for what I've seen for a lot of B2B business type of business models, they tend to be more sort of like centralized because the sale can actually be closed, online, right? And through market visits once a quarter. So then, of course, you can kind of like, group everyone into like a hub instead of distributing people across countries. Yep.
Yeah,
Thank you.
excellent. Yeah. But generally, to answer Wilson that question, once you scale, once you have size, once you build your brand, usually you're gonna have to end up with a local office. It just, especially in Asia, I think still, if you're in the B2B, I have a separate answer from Joel. If you have B2B customers, they don't see you. If you're always online or you see them once a quarter, it doesn't really serve very well. But it's high touch. All right, so you need to be on the ground if you want to scale your company, your business overall.
Yep.
Last question.
Yes, I have a very final question. So since we only have 2-3 minutes left, actually, this question is kind of like a summary of you guys discuss about how to extract talents, especially from Silicon Valley. So this question is that what's the biggest challenge for Silicon Valley-based talent looking to move to and work in Southeast Asia? And what are the biggest cultural difference between tech companies in US versus Southeast Asia? So actually it's 2 questions.
Yeah,
let's focus on first one first.
Yeah, good question. All right, JS, you've done it yourself. Why did you do it? Why did you move back to Singapore and launch your startup?
Yeah,
all right, that's a good question.
Yeah, well, I would say the biggest thing is just having I would summarize it in a word, awareness. And a big part of the awareness is the humility. I think that for me, when I left SF, after working at Dropbox and Lyft, and then I moved to China and then I moved back to Singapore. The biggest thing when I came back was that I felt like I was the most arrogant guy because I was like, dude, I worked at the best companies, man. What is Southeast Asia? And that was the biggest lesson for me, because that's totally not true. What you don't realize is that the markets are entirely different, and you do have certain experiences and skill sets, but it's not about one being superior to the other. It is about one being complementary to the other. And the only way that it can be complementary is if you have that awareness and that humility to know that, I'm here to learn as much as I am here to contribute. And that is also the reason why a lot of startups that just come here fail because of a lack of that. So what do I mean by that specifically? I mean by that specifically in 3 ways. The first is when you think about your business idea, just because it's worked somewhere else doesn't mean that it will work here. The second is in terms of hiring and managing people. Just because you've worked with the best, and that is a blessing and it's fortunate that we can do that, doesn't mean that you can expect that same level here, because it's an entirely different market. And so it's very easy to come to Southeast Asia and just complain about everything. Oh man, I can't find engineers, talent here sucks or whatever. But actually that doesn't do you any service, because that is what it is. And the great entrepreneurs and the great, leaders in tech recognize that, and they think one step ahead of how to improve that instead of just, whining and complaining about the problem. And then I think the third thing is ultimately it's about the users and consumers you're serving, right? Just because folks, the end users have a different preference, doesn't mean that it's good or bad or anything, especially when you're building for a global audience.
So to answer the second question, what about the culture differences?
Yes.
Working for Silicon Valley tech company versus Southeast Asia.
Yeah. The first thing I would point out is that difference has narrowed significantly just in the past 2 to 3 years alone. And the reason is because founders are a lot more diverse and a lot more sort of, have matured a lot. So for example, you can have a founder here, but that person has attended YC. And so then you sort of have all of that experience. So you can have a founder here that has worked at a great company before. So I would say that the differences have narrowed. And if I were to put it at one thing, I think it's the recognition. I think it's sort of always a balance in terms of recognizing that technology is the edge, more than a traditional business way, but also having the maturity and the humility to recognize that at the end of the day, all of our businesses are tech enabled. That you don't start and use the technology for the sake of using a technology. It has to serve a broader business purpose. And so I think that to me, the biggest difference is sort of like the recognition of that. I mean, of course, Silicon Valley is known for, no pay leave, great benefits and all that. I think that on the surface, that has also been reduced because of all the layoffs that's happening. So the combination of that and the fact that the maturity of the startup ecosystem has come up has sort of like narrowed that. But I think that the biggest thing is still comes back to the companies are different because of the three things that I mentioned, which is your idea, the people, and in terms of your own attitude.
Excellent. So let me reframe that last question, Wilson. I want to ask you, because he hired international talents all over the world when he was running Groupon Asia Pacific. That question is really just, someone from Silicon Valley going to Southeast Asia, what culture differences to expect. Joel, put your perspective. You're the employer. How do you summarize hiring global talents, particularly in the US? From your perspective, is that good? Do you think it's a wise decision, or they fit well, or they're just bad choice to hire these people?
Yeah, I think what JX shared earlier, I would say that because Southeast Asia, there is, let's not also mistaken Southeast Asia for Singapore, right? I think Singapore is the most conducive, right, environment for, like if you want to feel closest to like the US, then go to Singapore first, yeah? But actually 9 out of the 10 countries in Southeast Asia is not like Singapore. So just to put some context in, right? Yeah, it's easiest to sort of like assimilate, right? When we have a team, like I've always had a team and like large team in Singapore. It's great, most of my US, European team members, they want to like move at the first place, or if not the only place they want to move to is Singapore, right? And I can understand that, especially if they have like family, kids, international school, everything's set up pretty well, right? But there's also another breed of American or US-based entrepreneurs who love to get into the deep end of the local markets. Then they would tend to, some of them actually kind of funny enough, they will start in Bali, right? So they start with like enjoying themselves, right? Sort of building that lifestyle, that community, and then they kind of move out from Bali. But some like get straight into business. Yeah, they would go straight to Jakarta. That's the biggest market in Southeast Asia. So out of 600 million people, 200 million in Jakarta. And you could actually build a VC-funded business just focus on Indonesia, in Jakarta, for example, right? Without even tackling 9 other countries in Southeast Asia. So yeah, or you could go to like Kuala Lumpur, right, in Malaysia, or Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. So that's a different choice point, right, altogether. So typically, if you're like single, young, and you really want to get into really local market, you could dive into markets like that. But if you want to pick one out of, I would say Indonesia would be a better one to pick, because whatever that you build there, at least as a single market, it can be funded, right? Because if you do it in other markets, you may face challenges in fundraising because the market size may be too small. But if you want sort of like an inch into the Southeast Asia market, Singapore is super comfortable. I think it's a great place to start. Yeah.
Okay, so time is up. Wilson, any other question that popped in?
No, that's all.
Good. All right, so we're gonna wrap up. So I'd like to first thank our audience. Thanks for it's dinner time. So thank you very much for attending our event today. And I want to also thank Singapore Global Network and also our sponsor from Monty J. So we do run a series of Southeast Asia events. And so look up for more. If you like, please become our member. And then we'll see you again. All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.